This is Professor Warren, and today we'll be going over arguments based on logos. So, as we discussed, logos is arguments based on reason, logic, and facts. While good arguments utilize logos, they usually have some sort of clear argument or thesis. Not all do. Goes into what your reading talked about with artistic proofs and inartistic proofs. So again, just because an argument utilizes logos doesn't mean they may use facts, right? Artistic proofs are constructed arguments that appeal to reason or common sense. So for instance, if I, made an argument that, killing people is wrong, right? While you could use facts and statistics to maybe prove that, maybe show how people's lives are detrimented, mental health, etc., etc., that's a reasonable assumption, right? That killing people is wrong. I don't have to provide, facts or statistics, and I could, but an artistic proof is just a constructed argument where the argument you're making is just reasonable or it's common sense. And that would still be logos, right? It's utilizing logic to make a reasonable conclusion. Inartistic proofs are, again, when you make an argument that utilizes hard facts such as facts, statistics, testimonies, witness statements, contracts, documents, that sort of thing, right? So don't go in here thinking that all logical arguments have to utilize facts and statistics. Very much a logical argument can also be one that's just constructed on common sense, on reasonable assumptions, right? And in addition, when we're talking about logical arguments, all arguments that use logos, not all arguments that utilize logos do so in a good way. So again, just because someone provides, maybe hard facts and statistics doesn't mean the argument is good in itself, right? Sometimes we can construct an argument that's not very good. However, there may be some hard facts and statistics, right? Maybe somebody makes an argument and they try to utilize evidence, but you still don't buy it, right? It's not persuasive. So don't think that just because someone utilizes, stats, pie graphs, what have you, that it means it's 100% a good argument, right? Again, that's why you have to utilize rhetoric in a persuasive manner. So two ways you can tell if a logical argument has a good structure is it has a statement and then a proof, right? So it gives you a statement about something and then it follows it up with proof. Now, if you're missing one or the other, right, that could sort of hint to you, hey, this argument is not logical, right? So again, it has to have some sort of statement, right? It's talking about something and then it provides that sort of logical evidence or that just reasonable assumption to it, right? If it's missing one or the other, it's probably bad, right? So for instance, going with the first one, killing people is wrong. I would add on to that, killing people is wrong because, it harms the lives of others and it, reinforces a society that prioritizes, the extinction of human lives, right? That might be a reasonable assumption without utilizing hard facts or statistics. But if I just said killing people is wrong, I have somewhat of a statement there, but I need to utilize some sort of proof as to why that would be. It also goes into the idea of fake news, right? Because fake news likes to utilize facts, quote unquote facts and statistics. And sometimes they do. They provide maybe a true, say for instance a poll or a survey, right? But they misconstrue it or manipulate it in a way to manipulate you. So fake news can be, things people make up, or they exaggerate the truth, or they cherry pick information. But just, so we're all on the same page, fake news is anything that's false or misleading information under the guise of news. And the reason fake news exists is to either damage the reputation of an individual or entity, to make money, right? Maybe they're trying to mislead you so you'll buy something, or to promote an ideology, right? We see this very much in politics and religious organizations. Not all, but quite a few, right? Now, again, fake news is something that we talk about a lot, but it is important to note, right, that fake news has been around since ancient times. It's not a new phenomenon. Ever since people started to communicate with one another, fake news has existed. I do give an example here of yellow journalism. Yellow journalism was the name of fake news back in the 1800s. The reason they called it yellow journalism was it was biased, it was misleading, and And there would be a lot of fake news who would just mail out fake news to people, and they, some people bought it, right? So just, be aware, right? When we talk about fake news or you hear it, it's not a new phenomenon. Humans have been doing it forever. That's why you also need to be aware of when somebody utilizes logos to manipulate you. You might be sitting here thinking, well, obviously, if somebody utilizes facts and statistics, that should change our perspectives. And it sometimes does. So, hopefully, you are someone who, when you're presented with evidence that is strong evidence, reasonable evidence, that you would change your perspective on something, right? But a lot of people don't do that. People have held beliefs, right? And they don't want to be questioned on those beliefs. Some people might not be good critical thinkers, and so the facts and statistics don't, register in their brain. So you might be frustrated at this, and it is frustrating, right? When you provide good, solid evidence and it doesn't change someone's perspective, right? That's why we utilize other appeals alongside logos, right? Maybe some pathos, right, to connect with your audience, or maybe some ethos to provide credibility. So just be aware, right? Just because you give me a stat and statistics, say, in your paper, you then need to elaborate on how it sort of persuades, or what it's doing to bolster your argument, right? Because facts and statistics don't speak for themselves, and people are likely not convinced if you just throw one out there and you don't elaborate on it. This was a very interesting one. In a copy of Psychology Today, Elizabeth Kolbert, in her article, Why Facts Don't Change Our Minds, she says, thousands of subsequent experiments have confirmed and elaborated on this finding. As everyone who's followed the research or even occasionally picked up a copy of Psychology Today knows, any graduate student with a clipboard can demonstrate that reasonable-seeming people are often totally irrational. Rarely has this insight seemed more relevant than it does now. So in that article, she just sort of goes over this idea that, you can present ideas and arguments to people, and even people who, you would consider to be smart are unreasonable, right? So just be aware, right? You have to elaborate on your logos. You have to provide good logos, elaborate on it, explicate it. How does it bolster your argument? And oftentimes you have to even add additional evidence to support those logos, right? Because one person's word likely is not going to convince somebody. So just be aware of that. It talks about DACA, right, which was a program to help children, mainly from Mexico, to get a good education here in the United States. Just the long and short of it, right? And so let's look at how Attorney General Jeff Sessions used, or the logos he tried to use, when talking about why the DACA program was rescinded or taken away. He utilizes logos, but he does so in a manipulative way. So let's look at something that seems like good logos, but is not good logos.
Good morning. I'm here today to announce that the program known as DACA that was effectuated under the Obama administration is being rescinded. The DACA program was implemented in 2012 and essentially provided a legal status for recipients for a renewable 2-year term, work authorization, and other benefits, including participation in the Social Security program to 800,000 mostly adult illegal aliens.
So, in that beginning section right there, mostly what he says is true, right? President Obama, they, put in the DACA program, right, in 2012. But this is where it starts to fall apart. He says that they were mostly adults, right? And that was not the case. They actually had to be children to qualify for the program, or they had to have been in the United States as children to qualify for the program. But let's, continue to listen.
The policy was implemented unilaterally to great controversy and legal concern after Congress rejected legislative proposals to extend similar benefits on numerous occasions to this same group of illegal aliens. In other words, the executive branch, through DACA, deliberately sought to achieve what the legislative branch specifically refused to authorize on multiple occasions. Such an open-ended circumvention of immigration laws was an unconstitutional exercise of authority by the executive branch. The effect of this unilateral executive amnesty, among other things, contributed to a surge of minors at the southern border that yielded terrible humanitarian consequences. It also denied jobs to hundreds of thousands of Americans by allowing those same illegal aliens to take those jobs. We inherited from our founders and
Okay, so this is where, again, he goes on to use some, freedom language, right? But already, right, he, appears to be utilizing logos, facts, and statistics. But the problem is he's utilizing those in a way that is misleading. So, for instance, he said that because of DACA, there was a surge in undocumented children. And it is true. There was a surge of unaccompanied children that caught the Obama administration off guard during 2012. But the number of unaccompanied minors crossing the border peaked in 2014 at 68,541, dropping to 42% in 2015 before rising again. So, while he says it was because of DACA that there was a surge, number one, that wasn't true. It wasn't because of DACA. This is something, rises in unaccompanied children grow and fall, right? Again, and as there are other outside circumstances and multiple different types of circumstances that lead to these sorts of things. So he's trying to equate DACA with all these unaccompanied children, right? Which again, he said earlier, they were supposed to be adults, but now we have children here. So that's very interesting, right? So again, he's trying to equate one thing with something that's not related. Secondly, even if, right, those children, came to the border to utilize DACA, right, it should be noted that those who cross the border illegally do not qualify for DACA, right? It had to have been you were brought into the United States and you've been living here as a citizen, right? Or at least, had a work visa to be here. So, he's wrong on that part, that, they crossed into the border to get to DACA. No, they would not have qualified. They had to have been here for a very, very long time. Yes, they could have been brought here illegally, but they had lived here so long in the United States that they could be qualified for the program. It wasn't just cross the border illegally, I get DACA, I'm here to stay, right? No, there's much more that went into it, but so him saying, it's all these illegal children coming here, that's not how it would have worked, right? So again, listening to that, it's a lot of jargon, and you may believe it just by initially reading it, but he utilizes logos in a misleading way. So again, always criticize, be skeptical, look into information, don't just accept it as true. Because it could be very easy to accept this as true. That's why I give you factcheck.org. There's other websites like Snopes and factcheck.org that do a very good job at providing unbiased, credible information. So if you ever see something or you hear maybe someone speak about something, if they're, a well-known politician, you definitely could go onto Snopes or factcheck.org, and they're run by donations. They don't take a particular stance. And what they'll tell you is they might say, hey, some of this is true, some of this is misleading, or all of this is untrue, or this is true, right? So again, if you ever have a question, you see something online and you're not too sure, factcheck.org or Snopes, SNOPES, are very good sources to double check that information. We talked about how things can be misconstrued, right? Statistics is one of those that can be very misleading at times. Not to say that all stats are misleading, but they are ones that oftentimes people utilize in a misleading way. So for instance, sorry that this is so blurry, it's the only one I could find, but this was a very famous Colgate ad that said, more than 80% of dentists recommend Colgate. So, based on that, right, what would you think? You would think, 80% of dentists in the, United States must agree with that, right? that would be a misleading statement, right? Because what they didn't tell you, right, more than 80% of dentists recommend Colgate, was that in the survey Colgate did, they were allowed to name more than one brand. So they cherry picked the information, and so since they allowed people or dentists to put many different brand names that they liked, they just took everyone that said Colgate. They didn't look at, okay, well, maybe, people are rating them, right? Or maybe we get, another brand of toothpaste, right? Crest, for instance. So that can be a misleading statistic. And it's funny to note Colgate was also, they came under fire by the Advertising Standards Authority. Because this was misleading, they had to take it down. But just be aware, right? Just because something is a statistic, you need to read into it, right? What are you getting from that? And then check it with the actual evidence that was provided, right? Or the survey that they did, and see, is there room for bias, right? Or is the person who's telling me this information, are they misleading me about it, right? So again, stats are good, but they can be misleading, right? Because they're often worded in ways that could, make you not only skeptical of the information, but also maybe just falsely mislead you. Now, it's important to note facts and statistics. This is another thing that students don't typically understand until it's explained to you, right? While facts can oftentimes stand on their own, right, statistics often can't, right? Numbers rely on interpretation. So if we went back to the Colgate example, right, if I took away all the words and I just put 80%, would you know what that meant? Now you probably are saying, well, I know that's an 80 and I know that's a percent, symbol, but you don't know anything else. Numbers don't speak for themselves. We have to interpret those numbers, right? Because without any words or anything, that number is just a number, right? We know it might be 80 and it's a percent, but we don't know what else that means, right? So be aware of that, right? Numbers, because people have to interpret them, right? They have no meaning by themselves. This can be misused, right? People have particular agendas and they can misconstrue you, right? Like with that other advertisement with the Colgate, right? So they had to provide their own explanation for that 80%, and they did so in a way that was misleading, right? So again, be aware if you provide numbers or you see someone provide numbers, make sure that you are aware, hey, that number had to be interpreted by someone. Maybe I should check the original source to make sure that that person reiterated that statistic in a factual way. Surveys and polls. Surveys and polls are good ways to explore an issue, right? Because sometimes we want to see what people's subjective views are, right? Because again, just because something's not objective, right? It's subjective, it's still valuable, right? So if you wanted to say, oh, what do people think of, Fayetteville State University, and you polled people on their feelings about it, that would still be valuable information, right? You could see maybe where you can improve and stuff like that. Now, the problem with polls and surveys, again, their construction. So you have to be very thorough when you're making a survey, right? You have to make sure the wording isn't biased. You have to make sure that, that you're asking the right questions. Maybe for a survey, you can do, put a 1 for very dissatisfied and put a 5 for very satisfied, right? You have to consider, is that the best, way to grade people's, say, happiness about the university? Or should I leave it should I leave the section blank so people can write in what they say, right? So sometimes surveys, they're constructed poorly. The people don't ask the right questions, or they ask them in a misleading way, or the way in which they have people rate their experiences might not be the best way to rate it for that experience. Again, they're subjective, right? So again, if I asked you how you felt about the university today and say you got a parking ticket, you might tell me you hate the university, but say at the end of the semester you got all A's and your professors are saying good job, your opinion on the university might change, right? So again, surveys and polls, because people are participating and they're using their subjective experiences, that also makes surveys a bit iffy at times, right? You have to consider that. They can be misleading. So, for instance, I like to give this example. When Trump was running for president, I saw there was an ad that came up on my social media and it said, "Rate the president." And I noticed it was hosted by a Republican organization. And I'm very inquisitive, so I wanted to see what questions they were asking. And this is just an example, but they had one that said, rate how the president is doing. And they gave you 5 options. And each of those options was not a negative response, they were all positive responses. So if they then take that information and publish it, people are going to think that everyone that participated thinks of Trump in a positive way, right? There was no negative responses to any of the questions. It was basically like patting his back. So be aware of that, right? It also goes into the construction of it, but just be aware, right? They could be completely misleading. And as I said, people are volatile, people are fickle, people change, they're dynamic. So again, the way you answer today may not be the way you answer a survey or poll tomorrow. Buzzwords. This is another one that people need to be aware of. When you utilize logos, some people, they try to mislead you by utilizing buzzwords. And what I mean by buzzwords are words like this. I'm going to go through these and then explain what they are. So things like pure, natural, organic, freedom, logic, better, cleaner, longer, faster, millennial, right? These words are considered buzzwords because they don't actually really mean anything, or their definition is very vague, right? So let's look at this example. Wendy's natural need to be aware of when it comes to logo buzzwords. Here to be a factual, reasonably mentioned word or phrase, but in all actuality are vague and make you sort of lead you to an assumption. So, for instance, I have this example, Wendy's natural cut fries. So if I asked you what natural meant, what comes to your mind? When I've asked students this in the past, when I say natural, some students may say, oh, well, maybe they cut the fries with a knife, right? They're not using a fry cutter. Or maybe natural meant the potatoes, right, don't have pesticides on them. But every time I ask it, I get different responses from different students. And so buzzwords like pure, natural, organic, freedom, logic, better, cleaner, longer, faster, millennial, right? Those words don't inherently mean anything, or at least have a very vague definition, right? So when Wendy's say, hey, we have natural cut fries, they want you to fill in the blank. What does natural mean? Without them having to do the heavy lifting. And again, it's a very effective misleading marketing tactic, right? Where they don't explicate what natural means. It looks logical or reasonable, right? You're like, oh, natural cut, I know what that means, right? They do that in a way that is misleading, right? So be aware of these buzzwords and challenge them, right? Be skeptical. Okay, well, you said it's, organic, right? And I know the U.S. government does not have a standard on organic, right? So is organic the same that this company says as it is that this company says? And is it the same as I understand the word organic, right? So be aware and be skeptical of these buzzwords. Testimonies and narratives, right? As we sort of mentioned, right? People are fickle, people change, right? So testimonies are not always reliable. Now, we mentioned when we talked about pathos, right? That testimonies can be good, right? Because if you throw statistics and facts and a pie graph on a PowerPoint, people aren't going to necessarily remember that. It's not interesting, right? However, when you utilize a testimony and you back that up with facts and statistics, it makes it a lot more powerful, right? So be aware, right? When someone gives a testimony, our memories aren't the best at times, right? Or depending on what happens in our lives, we may retell the story in a different way, right? So I give these lectures every semester, and each time I'm tweaking them, right? They're not the exact same lecture every time. So be aware of that. That's why if you ever write a paper and you utilize a personal testimony, you want to then back up that with some facts and statistics, right? So it really sinks in, it makes it much more credible. And this isn't me saying that, oh, people's personal experiences don't matter. They definitely do, But, you know, as we talked about with pathos, we can't have arguments based solely on emotion, so make sure to balance what they're saying with some hard evidence, right? So be, you know, aware and skeptical about testimonies and narratives. Reason and common sense. So this is where we delve into the philosophy territory, so we're only going to skim it. But as I said, right, if you don't have hard facts and statistics for your argument, you definitely can make a logos-based argument based on just simple reason and common sense, right? So when you don't have hard facts, utilize reason and common sense. So here's an example of deductive reasoning or a syllogism. All human beings are mortal. That's true, right? I don't need hard facts and statistics to prove that, right? We know as humans, every human has died, right? Socrates, who is a philosopher, is a human being. And you can say, yes, I know Socrates existed, he's a human being, right? Therefore, Socrates is mortal, right? They give us two reasonable claims, and then their conclusion is reasonable, right? So based on humans being mortal, Socrates is a guy. Hey, Socrates is mortal. That's reasonable, common sense, didn't need hard facts and statistics. Now, that isn't to say that this always works. I have another example here that says all ceilings are attached to walls. That's reasonable. All doors are attached to walls. That's reasonable. Therefore, all doors are ceilings. Now, that is not reasonable. And this is where, you know, arguments or logos arguments that utilize common sense and reasoning, this is where they can fall apart, where you may have two reasonable claims and then the conclusion you get is unreasonable or illogical, right? So, and that's one of their problems. They don't have that hard facts and statistics to back that up, right? And it's just completely nonsensical, right? So, while they do have some purposes, right, especially like, you know, for instance, right, proving something's mortal, right? That could be done with reason and logic. However, the other one shows sort of the faults with that, which is, hey, you know, sometimes people, if they make reasonable assumptions, the conclusion they draw, the conclusion they give you might be illogical. So don't just assume that the argument's good if the claims seem reasonable, because the conclusion they make could be illogical. Here are ways you could structure a logical argument. Now, this isn't all the ways, but these are the ones people normally do. The first one is degrees. So, a logical argument that utilizes degree basically says, hey, we should do more of this thing because it's good, or we should do less of this thing because it's bad. So it's measuring your decision based on how good or how bad something is, right? The degree to which it's good or bad. So, for instance, you may say, hey, we should do more recycling because recycling is a good thing and we'll have less trash in the street, right? That would be a degree-based argument. Or, hey, we should not have the death penalty, right? Because that's killing more people that could be innocent, right? That would be sort of a degree-based argument. So let's do more of this thing because it's good. Let's do less of this thing because it's bad. Analogies. Again, an analogy is when you compare one thing to another. So say an animal rights activist said, hey, we shouldn't put, you know, chickens in small cages. They should be free on the farm because it would be the equivalent of putting our children in cages, right? You can maybe, you know, pull apart that one, but that would be an analogy-based argument, right? Where you're comparing one thing to another thing. And when we talk about fallacies of arguments, so again, bad arguments, we'll go over when those analogies might not be good. But just be aware, right? Some people construct logical arguments by saying, hey, here's this thing, and it's similar to that thing, therefore we should do this, right? And then a precedent. So this is when you look at past decisions to say, hey, what should we do now? So for instance, I might look back to the way I taught one class and say, oh, the students didn't really get how to do citation. So when I do stuff in the present, I may say, hey, I looked to the past, students didn't get citations, so now I need to make sure that I change what I do and we focus more on MLA citations, right? We tend to do this all the time, especially with law, right? They look at past court decisions that influence what they're doing there, especially if the cases are very similar, right? So what precedent was set. So these are just a few ways you can construct a logical argument.